welcome everybody. We're just making a minute or two just to get everybody aboard. Right, looks like most people have joined now. So welcome everybody. My name is Philip Aldridge. I'm Executive Director at HAZANZ. I'll be your host today. Today's topic is working in and around vehicles in conjunction with ShopCare and WorkSafe. So thank you for coming on today. So we've got Ruth Cook from WorkSafe, Liz May, Catherine Ross, Wes Van Devinter from ShopCare, and they'll introduce themselves a bit more later on. And I'll hand it across to them shortly. So in terms of the format today, there'll be a sort of a tag team presentation for about 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. That's mainly the format. And there'll be 4 polls throughout the session, so I encourage you to participate in those polls. They are anonymous, so you can just click one or more options. So just in terms of those who haven't been on webinars before, down the bottom in the middle there is a Q&A button. So that's where you should, if you've got questions, fire them in there and we'll endeavour to answer them throughout the session. We'll also be sending out a copy of the presentation and the recording tomorrow. So you'll get that in your box and you have to write furiously. So before I hand across to Liz May from ShopCare, I'd just like to do a quick poll. So if you see that now on your screen, just about your sector, and if you let us know what sector you're working in, that'd be fantastic. Everybody's voted. Keep dropping in. Great. Thanks for that. Sometimes a bit hard to determine your sector. So these results, quite a few manufacturing, transport, warehouse, and quite a few another. Shouldn't state myself. So over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Phil. And just for everyone's interest in Zoom, you actually only have the option for 10, to enter in 10 options in a Zoom poll. So hence probably why we've got quite a few in the other bucket, Phil. So good afternoon, everybody. And it's fantastic to have you here today. And I'm thrilled to be able to co-host with Philip from HAZANZ and have Ruth Cook, engagement lead from WorkSafe, as a guest. So before I introduce Ruth in a few minutes, just want to introduce, I'll tell you a little bit more about ShopCare and introduce the team. But first of all, from what Ruth will talk to us about around vehicle-related harms, over the last 2 years, WorkSafe is looking to better understand harms that are common across sectors, and one of these is the harm caused to people who work in and around vehicles. Almost every business involves a vehicle movement in some way, yours does, and whether it's a delivery of raw goods, moving things around the warehouse, or just getting things out to customers. Because vehicles are so widespread, it's easy to become comfortable with the risks they present, but the message today is that we can all do something different and we all need to do something different. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about who ShopCare is, who we are and what we do. And then I'll introduce you to Wes and Catherine at the end, and they'll talk you through our key work streams and a project that we think you'll be interested in. So ShopCare was born out of a food and grocery safety working group that had been running for a very long time, and the very wise people on that group realised that really to make any big difference in health and safety in retail supply chain, that we needed some dedicated resource. So very long story short, a submission was put forward to ACC for some funding. ACC gave us that funding, and in conjunction with some industry members who also helped fund ShopCare, ShopCare now exists. So we've been running for just over a year, and we support all organisations in retail, supply chain, manufacturing and transport. And anywhere from manufacturing all the way through to the retail shelf, which is quite a wide breadth. ShopCare's role is to drive industry collaboration through a coordinated approach to knowledge sharing and problem solving. So how do we do that? Profile best practice methodology, create knowledge sharing opportunities, and develop industry agreed standards. And there are lots of ways that you can get involved with ShopCare and take advantage for your business of what we're doing. And our website will be up later on. One of the easiest ways to get involved is that when you do have a health and safety challenge that you don't know how to solve, then please get in touch. We'll have a look at what information or insights we have already. We'll reach out to our network or even go out to the wider industry anonymously to find a solution for you. And we're all about connecting people to people and people to solutions. So I'll introduce the team and hand over to them. So first of all, Wesley Van Deventer. Wes has a long career in health, safety and wellbeing in marine, engineering, manufacturing and retail sectors. And Catherine Ross has a long career in the education sector. And Wes and Catherine are going to talk you through our key work streams, and then Wes will talk you through our critical risk piece of work, which we're really excited about. So before I hand over to Catherine, there'll just be another short poll, which should be appearing any moment, hopefully.
So here we go. There's 3 choices this time. Slightly longer. I think it must have done now. Perfect. Thanks, everybody. So, yeah, almost half and half, 23, 23, and your son at 23. So,
that's interesting. So Ruth will give the answer to that in her presentation in just a few minutes. So I'll hand over now to Catherine.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine, and I'm just going to talk to you about some of the work streams that we are involved in at the moment, and then I will pass on to my colleague Wes. So first of all, transport is one of our main areas, and we are involved in developing an industry-led health, safety and wellbeing transport charter for the retail and supply chain sector. And our initial focus will be looking to address minimum standards for heavy goods vehicles, and these could range from things like well signposted bathroom facilities for truck drivers to more advanced sort of technical or engineered solutions. And we're working both with industry and government agencies such as WorkSafe and the NZTA to support this initiative. And the second thing I'll talk to today is site traffic management. And this is something which our industry sort of members and people we work with are really interested in. And it's a significant focal area for them. And as Liz sort of mentioned earlier, some of our work that we do is really connecting people together. So we're looking to connect people together so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. And we also aim to help WorkSafe engage with the wider community and industry on things that they're working on, so that other people can benefit from that. And today's presentation is a way to actually show that in motion. And I'll just pass on to Wes now, who's going to talk to you about the other 3 areas you can see on your screen.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for introducing me, Catherine. My name is Wes, and I look after basically retail manufacturing and some of the distribution point of view from my ShopCare side. So for us, I chair a collective working group, and they, represent anything from a medium to large businesses, and they really focused on trying to create, how would I say, safer workplaces sooner for each and every single worker. So there's a lot of investing going on from a time perspective and trying to come up with some of these solutions. And majority of these businesses, they all on a different stages of their health and safety and well-being maturity journey, which is absolutely fantastic. You can see some of those coming up, and some, just excelling to what they already have. But coming back to the slide, is that some of our work streams is manual handling based, And that's one of our biggest areas for a lot of businesses, and not just for us, but also a big spend for ACC. And we are trying to come up or explore opportunities and best ways how to prevent injuries. What's the best strategy to follow? Is there an education side to this as a competency, and or possibly how just to manage injuries properly to try and get that worker rehabilitated back into their workplace, and also, how would I say, save some spend on ACC's budget as well. So we're trying to really to work in that space and see what we could do. And it's always not just always training, but we look at all factors, or exploring all factors in that sector. The next one going up is violent and aggressive behavior. And this is the biggest focus point for retailers currently in our industry. This is mostly from public onto their worker, anything from, just verbal abuse to actual physical assault and even worse. So we're exploring all type of opportunities there, how we can safeguard workers, including from a public perspective. And then lastly, and we've mentioned it quite often in this presentation already, is critical risk. And critical risk is not a new thing. It's been talked about quite heavily in the industry. And what we're trying to do there is, from a ShopCare point of view, is we've never ever had a view of what does critical risk look like in our industry. So part of the work stream is to develop that view and see what is the most important, or what's the most common type of risks. And this is where we're going to put a lot of energy in trying to get to that safer workplaces sooner. That's just work streams in a whole, but I'm going to carry on to the next slide, which is carrying on to critical risks. So if you look at this snippet of the chart from a critical risk perspective, just for our industry, I'm going to talk to from bottom to top. These are our most common critical risks for the businesses that we've collected so far. So we're not saying these are the most important, but what we are saying, these are the most in common. So from the bottom, which is the most common, we'll see is site traffic management. No surprise there, vehicle versus pedestrian, vehicle versus vehicle versus fixed object. Is the next one down is on-road safety, and that's mostly pinpointed at light vehicle, passenger vehicles. So this is your sales rep or grey fleet, etc., in a car driving every single day on the road. They're quite exposed to a number of risks because half of their job or half of their day is split up being either in front of a client or in the actual car driving around on our roads. Thirdly is hazardous substances. These is just basically handling and transport of hazardous substances, asbestos, etc. And then we're looking at working at heights. Next up is mobile plant and equipment, yet again loading and unloading of trucks, high speed, low speed, possibly like forklifts, and vehicle versus pedestrian, etc. And then the only obviously I'm going to talk about quickly is machine safety and guarding, which is mostly for manufacturing point of view. And then lastly, transportation. So out of our top 7 from our industry, there's at least 4 of them that's related to transport some way or form, or vehicles in some way or form. But what is also interesting, if you look at this graph, is some of the things that are maybe not on here. So for example, there's quite a lot of talk in New Zealand or globally regarding mental health, psychosocial harm, mental well-being. But from the sample that we've got so far, mental well-being or mental psychosocial harm is way lower on the list. It has not been identified as a critical risk by so many organizations. Otherwise, it would have shown higher on our list. Another thing, for example, is from a transport point of view, is that even though transport is being represented on this graph as the number 7 position, they have not identified, and yet again, I'm talking about the sample pool here, identified light vehicle or passenger vehicles as a critical risk. A very small portion of those sample pool has identified that as a critical risk. So it's a lot of interesting stuff that we're looking in, that we can delve in a bit more deeper and see what we can do about it. And then a last thing, if I look at that slide, or I look at the entire slide in total, is that there's quite a big shift in focusing on identifying workers that are exposed to either hazardous subs, fumes, vibration, and what does the long-term effect is going to be on? Is it going to be ill health? Is it going to be possibly even be worse? And what we can do and try and mitigate that now. So that exposure is a key focus now for our industry as well. But it's yet again not really listed on as a critical risk itself. So in a nutshell, that is that from our most common critical risk in our industry. We are behind this. There'll be quite a bit more coming your way. So we are working on a bit more resources. We're trying coming up a bit more with a resource in a sense where organizations can actually go and try and identify their critical risk for those who have not identified yet, and not just the critical risk, but the actual controls. So our aim is not just to identify risk, but the actual controls as well. So we want to give you the solution as well at the same time, because we believe there's quite a lot of good work being done in silos in each organization. We're just trying to bring that all in and then share that as much as possible. So this resource is still in development. We're keen to connect with more organizations to try and refine our view of our industry, as well as collect some of those controls, that we can make sure that we are providing the right advice or the best practice advice that we can. So that's part of the next stage. We do have some other critical risks, things that will also be coming in the near future, but it's not too much I can talk about it. But what I could say is that definitely keep an eye out for this. If you want to get in contact with us regarding critical risk controls, please don't hesitate to contact me. Well, that's enough from my end. I hope you understood everything I said, because my accent could be a bit weird sometimes, and I do tend to ramble now and then, so I do apologize. But before I hand over to Liz, hopefully I won't bore you too much with another poll, but it's going to be a quick poll. If I can ask Phil, please, to pop up that poll for us. Thank you very much, guys, for your time.
So that's from quite a bit more thinking. I think you can do more than one answer to this one. Of course, there may be things on the list that the organisation is focused on that aren't on the list.
Yeah, and we had a real challenge, Phil, coming up with the 10 that we were going to include.
Everybody's voted, just about voted, so it's quite a big mix. Interestingly, someone, Mark, has mentioned his biggest, well, my company's biggest risk is distraction. Distraction and focus. Interesting. Vehicle risk. All right, we're in there. Thanks for that.
It's fascinating. Critical risks has the highest score, Wes.
Shane says time pressure, so it's really an impact on all types of health and safety practices. So what a mix there of different things, certainly critical risk.
Mix, isn't it?
Site channel management, psychosocial's coming up, competency education, work engagement. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Phil. That's really interesting. So I'll introduce and hand over to Ruth. So Ruth Cook, engagement lead for WorkSafe. And what does an engagement lead do? Connect industry and WorkSafe with a particular focus on transport and retail sectors. So over to you, Ruth.
Hi, and Thank you ever so much, Liz, and also Phil, for putting on this session that we've got. And thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to have this conversation, this really important conversation today. So why are we here? Why have we made this time for this conversation? As Liz mentioned, I'll reveal in a minute the number of or the percentage of our fatalities that are linked to vehicles. But just to let you know, when it comes to injuries or notifiable events, then vehicles are probably only linked to about 3% of those injuries. But when we think about fatalities, it jumps up to actually 73%. So I think, I can't remember, I think about half of you said that. So yeah, a staggering 73%. So only 3% linked to injuries, but when it comes to fatalities, it jumps right up to 73%. And I guess that's not a surprise. When a person interacts with the big, heavy moving object, it's always inevitable that the person is going to come off worse. And so really, what does that mean? That means that about 45 people a year don't come home to their families because they work in or around a vehicle. If we want to break that down, because always the question that comes next is, well, what kind of vehicle, which vehicle or mobile plant causes the most harm? Then what we see here is that it's trucks and lorries that come out top. So they are linked to about 30% of the fatalities. The next group of vehicles linked to harm are ATVs, that's usually quad bikes and tractors. So together they account for another 30%. And then down below you've got things like mobile plant, light vehicles, forklifts and other vehicles there. The other vehicles really is because we haven't got great information on those, so you sort of don't worry too much about that last one. But that just gives you an indication of the types of vehicle that are linked to harm. The other information that you can pick up from this chart is where this harm is happening. And this might actually come as a surprise to you, because with the exception of trucks, the majority of harm is taking place off-road. So about 65% of vehicle-related harm occurs off-road. So that will be things like on a farm. It will be, if we could just go back a moment, Catherine, sorry, if we, it might be on a farm, it might be linked to a construction site or on some other kind of work site. But of course with trucks that's almost flipped around, whereas 65% of other vehicle harm occurs off-road, and when it comes to trucks most of it occurs on road. Probably again no surprises there. So really what we're looking at here is an issue that is across sector, it's across the country, and it is also affecting almost every business that operates in New Zealand, because if they don't operate vehicles themselves, then they will be having vehicles delivered to them, they will be having vehicles pick stuff up, they will be having vehicles move around on their workplace. So this is really an issue that is right across our businesses in New Zealand. Another question that people often ask is, well, what percentage is work vehicles when we're thinking about road toll? We're finding out more and getting a better understanding of that all the time. So we sort of think at the moment that 23% of our road toll is linked to vehicles driving for work. So that's not commuters. That is people working or at the time of work. So we're really talking about a big meaty issue here. And of course it gets even bigger. Now we can move on to the next slide, Catherine. It gets even bigger when we think about work-related health. So it's really important to remember, and we try and talk about it as much as possible at WorkSafe, that acute harm is only about 11% of all work-related harm. actually the bigger burden is felt as a result of work-related health issues. So harm that occurs over time, but is linked linked back to the workplace. When it comes to working around vehicles, some of the key harm issues is firstly exposure to diesel exhaust fumes. So we think about 22 deaths a year in New Zealand as a result of exposure to diesel exhaust while at work. There's also the issue of back pain, often as a result of poorly designed seats and operating vehicles off-road, other musculoskeletal disorders, and then finally, but not lastly, not least, UV exposure. So just a reminder that we need to think about the whole breadth of work-related harm linked to vehicles, not just those acute events. Although having said that, that probably will be a little bit of our focus today. Great, so let's move on to the next slide. If we want to think, what are the things that are behind this kind of harm? We've had it mentioned already, site traffic management. So that interaction between people and vehicle in an off-road context where you've got that sort of dynamic interaction, often on a 24/7 basis. The other issue is to do with safe load management, unloading, loading, loads falling on people who are nearby. We've also got falls on the same level, so people tripping around vehicles or falling out of a vehicle. Non-use of seatbelts, and we'll touch a little bit more on that later. But we think about 10 people a year die because they don't wear a seatbelt at work. So we like to think we've moved on from seatbelts, but actually it's probably arguably the biggest cause still of work-related deaths every year. And then that last one is a really tricky one. So this is the upstream pressures. Those market pressures that are the result of increasingly decentralized working habits. And so you might have a harm occurring here, but the causes of that harm are way upstream through multiple layers of contracts and subcontracts, because there are so many players involved and people tend to offload harm to the next layer rather than dealing with it themselves. So an example might be of somebody who is, the harm might occur here because there's a delay, a pressure, all upstream. And we'll be thinking about this a little bit later on. So I'm sure we all understand it, but the upstream pressures is probably the biggest cause of harm, but actually probably also the hardest to deal with, but we'll come back to that later on. So if something is to change, then we've all got a role to play. No one can do everything, and that's really important to say, but we can all do something. And so I guess the question that I want to ask all of us today is, what can you do differently? We can't do everything, but we can all do something. So what can you do differently? And I want to just touch on two things that perhaps you could be thinking about in your role and in your business. So number one is using the supply chain. So let's go on to the next one. So I've just talked about how the supply chain is one of our biggest risk factors, but I think we need to be asking ourselves, how can we use it as also a way to drive better work and to drive safety, rather than just feeling that we're a victim of these downward supply chain pressures? How can we leverage off them to drive better outcomes for our workers? We recently, when it hasn't actually quite finished yet, have been commissioned some research through Mackie Research and around these supply pressures and how they result in vehicle-related harm. And one of the pieces of work that they did was always asking the question, but why? So something's happened, but why? But why? But why? And what you get is a really interesting picture of harm where something might happen down here, but the cause of it, of that harm, are multiple and exist at multiple levels. So for instance, a truck driver jumps out of the truck, twists their ankle, and as a result has a few days off work. Perhaps in the scheme of things, not a dramatic event, will get recorded in the accident register, but maybe not much more than that. But if we start asking the question, but why, we start to find out some really interesting things. So he falls out of the truck, he jumps out of the truck, awkwardly twists his ankle, but why? Because there was poor lighting in the area. But why? Because there'd been a change in depot, but why? Keep on asking this but why questions. There is a change in contractor, but why? Because the principal company has managed to find a cheaper company to do the work, and you suddenly taking it from a small event up to this really big system-wide level of issues and pressures that are resulting in harm. So you quite quickly see that actually what we're dealing with here is something that is complex and deep-seated and requires some really careful thinking, but still we can do something. We might feel like a very small cog in that supply chain, but we can do something differently. And how and why is because I believe that HAZWA, the Health and Safety at Work Act, gives us that duty to be thinking not only about our own workers, but also the workers whose work we influence. So we have to think about not only the people who work for us, but the people who work on the sites that we go to, the people who come onto our sites, the people who hire our equipment, the people who subcontract to us two levels up about, who then come onto our side. And so you suddenly start to see there's a much bigger web of people whose work we influence. And HAZWA starts to provide the means by having really powerful conversations about those workers. For instance, you can start to think about things like tendering and contracting. That's a really powerful tool for then starting to introduce the issue of safety at work, health and safety at work. So when you're next contracting or tendering out for transport, starting to think at that really high level, having conversations with procurement managers, business management, about how can we ensure that our tendering process prioritizes harm and when working around vehicles. Whenever I talk to people who sell vehicles or lease them, they tell me that when people come to them asking for a new contract in vehicle provision, they come asking for the cheapest option. And I think if things are to change, we start to think actually not about the cheapest option for vehicle procurement, but about the safest, most efficient, most effective option for better work. Suddenly, and whereas that cost might have seemed a barrier before, actually if we start to think about duties under the Health and Safety Act, at Work Act, we can start to have different conversations at a senior level around how can we make sure that all our tendering, all our contracting, all our procurement doesn't just have health and safety as a tick box or as a nice to have, as a sort of an add-on, but it becomes a key part of that process. And we actually produced a guide that's on our website a couple of years ago, which actually starts to look at how you might introduce health and safety at that level of contracting and tendering, because it's a powerful tool and it's a tool that we can use to leverage off the Health and Safety at Work Act. So if we're thinking about what can we do differently, well, I'd like to say, let's be looking at how we can use the supply chain and leverage off those market powers, leverage off the Health and Safety at Work Act to do things differently. So one thing that we could all be doing differently, using the supply chain to drive better ways of working. One of the other things that we could be doing differently is thinking about the hierarchy of controls. Now, I realise that I'm talking to a group of people who know a lot more about the hierarchy of controls probably than I do. But I think it's always good to remind ourselves that workers who work around vehicles are required to be given the highest level of protection that's reasonable. And what we're not seeing is enough organisations who are really prepared to grapple with that really brave decision of, can we eliminate people from the workplace, eliminate people from working in and around vehicles altogether. I went onto a site recently who had made a really brave decision to rearrange the whole depot to keep people out of the areas where forklifts were working. That required investment, it required some really brave decisions and a bit of pushback, but they managed to achieve it. Now they've got a really large area of the warehouse where there are no people. So it's about having those brave conversations at a high level and only moving to the lower levels of control where that's not possible. So what conversations can you be having, again using HAZANZ as a bit of a lever, around removing people altogether, around putting in barriers, around procuring safer vehicles with better safety features. Yes, it requires higher investment, but I think HAZANZ gives us a great place to be starting to have that conversation. Too often what we see and what our inspectors see on a daily basis is organisations who start at the bottom and who immediately jump to things like training and PPE. And while I'm not saying that training it doesn't have its place, do you remember how we started off by saying that vehicle harm is a low frequency, high impact event? People will make mistakes, and because those mistakes around vehicles don't happen as often as others, it's very difficult to train them, and it means that people, because it happens frequently, they have this really high level of indestructibility when it comes to working in and around vehicles. There's a sense of, I've never had a problem before, only idiots have problems, I'm all right. So we need to be really brave in, yes, looking at our contracts, our tendering process, but also making sure that we are looking at those high level controls and really looking at how can we rearrange work activity, workplace at a big system level, rather than just always coming down to, oh, let's just introduce more training. So those are the things that we are seeing when businesses grapple with. Then we're starting to see some change. So when we're thinking about what can we do differently, what are some of the things that we could do differently around those two areas, so high level controls and also tendering and contracting and using the supply chain to drive better work. Now, I said that if things are to change, then we all have a role to play. And I do also mean us, the regulator. We also have a role to play. And this just gives me a chance to update you on a couple of things that we have been doing as an organisation recently. We have been increasing our focus as an organisation on risks created by working in and around vehicles. So that is much more across the organisation, something that we are focusing on. As a result of that, we are also increasing our focus on the transport, postal and warehousing sector. And it means that up to about 11 to 15% of our proactive inspector visits are now linked to this sector. So that's a real increase in some areas. We're also looking at how we can work better with NZTA and CVST, particularly when it comes to vehicle harm on the road, where we have to really share that duty with other agencies. Thinking about some specific things that we have been doing, if we can move on to the next slide, thanks Catherine. Some specific things that we have delivered recently. Firstly, is a fact sheet around seatbelts. So I mentioned that arguably that's the biggest single cause of work-related fatalities every year. Non-use of seatbelts. What we don't want to do is push that right down to the driver and think, oh, it's just about the driver and what they need to do. Actually, what does the whole organisation have to do? What role can they play in ensuring and monitoring seatbelt use? So we've just produced a fact sheet which has some ideas around what the PCBU can do in that regard. And we've also produced some good practice guidelines for site traffic management. And this is the first time that New Zealand's had this under HAZWA. And so what we know is there's some great practice going on in pockets, but it's inconsistent. So before we did anything else, we had to come up with a level playing field around what is good when it comes to site traffic management. And we're doing some more marketing. You might have seen some things coming out about seatbelts. And as I've already said, we're increasing our inspector focus. Now we know those things are just the beginning. We know that those are only the start of a lot more work that we need to do. And we know that increasingly as an organisation, we too need to get into that supply chain space where we're not just looking at what we can see and smell and touch when we walk into a workplace, but who are the other organisations and people and bodies who have made decisions that result in harm further downstream. So we know that we need to work in that space. That was one of the key drivers for us doing some research through Mackie and Co. So we'll be really looking forward to seeing what comes out of that and what further work we can do. So we know that we need to do things differently, and we know that we've got a lot more to do in this area. We're just scratching the surface. And we're looking forward to working with you on that and getting your feedback so that we can do that more effectively. So I'm going to wrap up there because I'm kind of keen to hear questions. So before I ask you for questions of me or Liz or Phil, I guess I want to ask you a question. And this is a question that I've already asked you, which is what could you be doing differently? If we're to see a real and sustained change to levels of harm to people who work in or around vehicles, what do you need to do differently? We can't do everything, but we can all do something differently. So what can you do differently? And then my second question to you is, how can WorkSafe support you in that process? So leaving with you with those questions, but I'm very aware that some of you may have a question or a comment. So it's over to you. I don't know quite how this goes, Phil. Do I see the questions coming up?
Yeah, so if you've got any questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A function and Liz or Ruth will answer them. There's one question here, actually. Actually, is there a question or a comment? Under the chat, actually. Would using the supply chain include leasing of buildings in the shopping centre contracts?
Sorry, I didn't catch that, Phil.
There's one question here. I think it's talking about supply chain. Does that include buildings and shopping centres? So leasing, for example, if people are leasing buildings and getting transport into them, getting goods delivered, presumably that covers the whole supply chain angle.
Yeah. So I think the question that you just asked is, when it comes to supply chain, does that include people who lease the buildings?
Yep.
Yeah. I think we do have to start thinking really broadly. Especially, I can't remember the facts now, but in Auckland, the number of warehouses that are opening on a weekly basis warehousing, people who build the warehouses and then lease them out make money on the amount of storage space. But of course, if you are somebody who then leases that warehouse, you also need space to turn vehicles and to manage that interaction of people dropping off and picking up. And so I think that people who build the warehouses have a role to play. We need to think about how local councils and local authorities also have a role to play in what buildings they allow to be built and what space there is. So it's a really big issue. It's not a quick fix here, but I think we need to think more broadly about the supply chain and the responsibilities.
Thanks, one question here from Tamsin, sorry. How do we get hold of the work-related fatalities injury data?
The work-related, sorry, the injuries. So if you're thinking acute injuries, are on our website. So there, I think sometimes the easiest way to negotiate our website, which is to put it straight into Google rather than go in the WorkSafe website. So if you Google WorkSafe Data Center, then you can get in and you can start to play around with some of the filters, and you can start to break it down by year or by region or by sector. So that would be first port of call. And there's also some information on our website around work-related health and some of the work that we're doing in that space to better understand the challenges there.
Cell phone usage. To what extent WorkSafe investigations uncovering this?
I'm not aware of an investigation, but I'm not saying that it hasn't, but I do know that businesses businesses who were thinking about working through critical risks linked to vehicles, they know that distraction is a real issue for them. And often looking at, there's increasingly good technology in that area. Even a dash cam could be something I know that has been used effectively, or technology that will block the mobile phone and doesn't let it work while it's driving. So there are things, but yes, without a doubt, distraction is an issue.
Cool. Not sure if I can read this one, Ruth. It's quite a tricky one. It's quite a long question. The first question there from an anonymous person. I think it basically says, I think it's prudent to discuss issues of actual risk reduction as a focus when tendering work. How do you see WorkSafe and others can make operational gains for tendering? It's kind of an unusual question, so I understand the question. You may have to go, Ruth.
Sorry, can I see the question? No, I don't think I can.
I think basically what you're saying is there's different parts of the business, like procurement doing tendering, but they are different from operational units and different from the public and sector roles. So how can we make things better, basically?
I'm just looking for the question. Is it in the chat?
Under Q&A.
Middle of the screen down the bottom there.
Okay, right. Okay, right. Look, I don't think I have got an answer, a simple answer to that, and I think this is something where I think that's probably a great question to open out to anybody in the chat function, is to what are you doing in this area that works? Yeah.
There's nothing here about lease vehicles. So you're saying I recommend to my clients to lease vehicles where possible, so they continually upgraded safety features their cycle for a lease term.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a reasonable approach?
I think that's great. Yes, and I think increasingly that as technology improves at a very fast rate. Increasingly, technology's got a role to play in how we manage people safely around vehicles. It's not going to be the only answer. We've got to have a really full, robust risk management plan, but I think technology has got a part to play. And so as it becomes cheaper and more reasonable to retrofit or to buy OEM with new safety features, I think then it becomes really important that people are doing that.
Yeah. Question here from Warrior about the impact of upstream stress management. How stress can also increase risk of others, such as during an accident. Any thoughts around stress management?
Yeah, I guess the question is thinking about how do we link upstream, or how do we better understand what those upstream pressures are, what impact they're having, not only on acute harm, but also psychosocial harm, that pressure of having to be on call 24/7, that pressure of having to, if you're a driver and you are only contracted to one other person, you really are very dependent on whatever work they can throw at you. So all those pressures and stresses, and I think, yes, we do need to be thinking about harm in a much more broadly. I can just see that someone has just sent in a question for Sue. How many of the vehicle incidents are impacted by fatigue at work? We don't know that, I'm afraid. Not something that we've got data on. I guess when it comes to impairment, there's all sorts of issues, a really complex place, and starting where an area we're only starting to really understand better. But yes, there is impairment caused by fatigue, by many things, and it's a challenge for businesses to be able to manage and also monitor that.
Yes, probably might come back with a couple more questions at the end. Thanks, that Ruth. So we're going to wrap up phase now, aren't we, everybody? Catherine.
Well, I've just seen a question that Steve's just sent in a question. Do we know what percentage occur on a third-party environment? I don't have those stats. It'd be really interesting to know if anyone else has got information from their own business on that. Is it mostly happening on your site? Is it mostly happening on other people's sites? That would be something really interesting to know a bit more about. We do know that when you're sending your people and your vehicles onto another site, that induction is a really complex and difficult process, and it's always difficult to make sure that your people are properly aware of those sites going onto someone else's, a third-party site. So that'd be really interesting to know if that is borne out by vehicle harm. But good question.
Cool.
So look, happy for you to get in touch. I think Liz is going to give you my contact details. So as I said, we're just scratching the surface here. There's some big complex issues, but we need to all do something differently to make a change in this regard. So thanks so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Philip, we just have one more poll to run.
What was that? Sorry.
I think we just have one more poll to run, but just while Philip's bring up the final poll for the webinar today, I think it's really, really important that a lot of the questions have been raised today, and with the answers as well, that the more people can share information, the better we can start to understand these issues and some of the solutions to these answers. So that's where it would be really, really beneficial for everybody that can to share information, and we're more than happy to help with that sharing of information. So I'll just let Philip run the last poll, and then we'll just share with you some contact details. So just around who will you share information or learnings with from the webinar today? If you could just answer that, we'll give you 30 seconds.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. Share results. Sorry, my fault. Mostly with media managers, supervisors, and the immediate team.
Thanks everyone for hopping on the call today, and thank you for answering the polls. It's really useful, very, very useful information. Thanks again, Philip, for co-hosting. You've been great.
Thank you, Liz, Wes, Catherine and Ruth, and thank you for coming on today, and I hope you have a safe rest of the week, especially before in Auckland, who are now having to go for another partial lockdown. So best of luck. In terms of the presentation and the recording, they'll be on the HAZANZ website shortly, so there'll be linked sent out tomorrow for you to access if you need to access it. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks a lot for that.
Thanks, Philip.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Yeah.
Thank you all.